place for sale in the Vermont farms and summer homes. So we thought the first opportunity we had, we would drop out for some more information if it hasn't been sold.
The first new wave of in-migration was bringing new values to bear. The final outcome was anybody's guess. Vermonters were buying their first electric appliances, including television sets. One-room schools were disappearing, and there was something new to worry about on the international front. Stay tuned for part 2 of Vermont Memories into the 50s. There had never been a decade like the 50s. In contrast with the dark depression and war years, here finally was a time of calm and plenty.
The 50s, to me, I remember as being a time when there wasn't a lot of hassles about anything.
Vermont was very quiet. Families are much closer in the 50s than they are today.
You stayed home and made your own enjoyment.
And so there were lots of kids everywhere.
And ladies were drinking. Before that, they really didn't drink, but now they could have a cocktail.
Eisenhower was president.
The car was a big thing in the 50s.
The 50s were absolutely
Full of chrome.
Everybody had saved their money.
Everybody had to have one.
They wanted.
Huge engines.
Because it was the era of affluence. The idea was 2 dogs and a white fence and a colonial house with flowers and window boxes and everything to go with it in the inside, like chafing dishes and toasters, the electric stove where you could set the timer and then go out and spend the afternoon with your friends and then come home and have a complete dinner all cooked for you. And don't think they didn't make a lot of that in the advertisements at that particular time.
With Swanson TV brand dinners, there's no work before dinner, no dishes after.
At Barry, in the central part of the state, the Rock of Ages quarries produce more granite and manufacture more memorials than any similar organization in the world.
Vermont's participation in the high times of the 1950s was full of inconsistencies. While there was growth, it wasn't exactly explosive. In fact, it would take a decade for the population to increase by 10,000. It seemed that in the Vermont of the 50s, as in later decades, the more things changed, the more they often remained the same.
The first airlines that flew out of here were Colonial Airlines, and it was old DC-3s that had been converted from their war duty.
There was regular passenger air service, but
it was amazing. If you go to LaGuardia Airport waiting for the plane, you knew everybody who was waiting for the plane. I mean, without exception, you knew everybody.
And Vermont was suddenly attracting lots of weekend ski tourists, but not at the expense of local tranquility.
He had no problems at all. We had one policeman in Middlebury. In fact, he was the guy who'd run the rope tow at the mountain in the wintertime, because there was nothing to do downtown. He had no problems with traffic, no problems with crime or anything like that, so he'd go up there and make his 65 cents an hour running the tow.
Throughout Vermont, the lines were suddenly blurring between urban and rural. Even in small town settings like Woodstock, milk could be delivered right to your door, and not just once a day.
The milk at that time was in glass bottles, 12 bottles to a wooden case. People used to have 2 deliveries a day because we're talking about an era when electric refrigerators were just becoming a possibility for families.
The teacher divides her time equally among the different grades and keeps each one busy all through the morning.
Yet another example of city ways reaching into the country during the post-war years was the loss of one-room schools. Vermont's tiny 1- and 2-room rural schoolhouses were the original bastions of local education, a distinction that came at a price.
The townspeople prepare their children well for their long, cold walk to school.
We used to walk to school through the woods. In the wintertime, the snow was right up to your hips. And if we had a bad snowstorm, they would come with a team, and then you have a iron kettle on the back to make us a pass. In the wintertime, you had to start the fire, and then you had to lug the water.
We used to drive a horse to school. In busy days, when Dad really had need for the horses, we'd take the milk to Fairfield Station and come back to school. So it meant, by the time we got to school, we had probably 11 miles on the mare before school started at 9 o'clock.
One room was 1 through 4, and then there was 5 through 8.
You sort of learned from the other guys. When the 3rd grade was having a class, you kind of picked that up, even if you were 1st or 2nd grader.
The older kids did a lot of teaching of the younger kids, which was really nice.
We lost a lot in going from the one-room schoolhouse.
I can remember when I was a little girl, Disney came out with Snow White, and some group here in Fairleigh got a bus organized, and all of the kids in town and their moms, and maybe some dads too, took a bus down to White River Junction, and that was a big event for us to go to the movies.
Movies were 35 cents, if I remember right. So we used to go to the movies a lot.
We had a lot of theaters that are no longer exist. One is the Majestic Theater, which used to play the Pearls of Pauline and had a lot of cowboy movies. That burned down, and the State Theater had a great following. They tended to put up the little more risque movies of the day. The Flynn was a great big show house like it always has been. But the most interesting theater of them all was the Strong Theater.
The Strong Theater was a beautiful theater for its time. The 2nd floor had upholstered seats the way the downstairs did. The upper story, the 3rd story, was just wooden seats, wooden backs, wooden sides, you sat on wood, very uncomfortable. And they never opened it up until the Glenn Miller story. They had such a huge demand for tickets for that particular movie that they even sold tickets up there. And if the band would get rocking and swinging along, you know, people start clamping their feet, and my God, the whole building would shake back and forth. And we were scared to death up there.
Low mobility and strict codes of conduct kept social life rather tame for 1950s teenagers, so activities tended to gravitate to the institution they knew best. The need for more things to do led to a golden era of high school sports.
In the 50s, basketball really rocked Barry all winter long.
Spalding, Montpelier, Burlington, Rice, Rutland, BFA St. Albans. Those were the big ones in Division I.
And you just had to be there, and people were. Suppers were postponed or were served early. Some students would go right up after school to be sure that they got in. The whole community thrived on basketball.
They used to play the state tournaments at the Barry Auditorium. Saturday had 4 championship games. It was something.
Vermont's other big high school sport was strictly homegrown. Interscholastic competitive skiing was a grassroots movement begun by a handful of idealistic winter enthusiasts. 2 names closely associated with the sport were Vermont Academy and Warren Shivers.
I'd been selected for the Olympic team. The war broke out, the Olympics were canceled, and so I started scrambling around for a job, and this is where I landed.
In the decades following his arrival, Shivers and Vermont Academy would win more skiing championships than any other school in the state.
My philosophy was that in order for a skier to reach his full potential, he needed to have an exposure to all 4 events. Those 4 events being cross-country, jumping, downhill, and slalom.